1203, inside the cold stone walls of Rouen, a 16-year-old prince vanished. No grave, no funeral. Only whispers of chains and blood on the floor that no one dared to speak of. Arthur of Brittany, nephew to Richard I, and the rightful rival to King John, had once been the hope of a fractured crown. Now his name was scrubbed from the record, as if he had never lived at all. Some claimed John, drunk with wine and rage, killed him with his own hands. Others swore his body was tossed into the Seine under the cover of night. But every trace disappeared with Arthur. And to understand how a prince could be swallowed by the darkness of power, we must return to the very beginning, to the moment his first cry echoed inside a royal house already rotting from within. He was born into a storm he could not see coming. In the summer of 1187, Arthur of Brittany entered the world not to inherit peace, but to step into a legacy already poisoned by rivalry. He was the posthumous son of Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, elder brother to the man who would become King John. His father was gone before his first breath, leaving him with no protector, only a claim that would divide two crowns. From the moment of his birth, he was both a promise and a problem. The Angevin Empire stretched from the green hills of England to the stone fortresses of Normandy, yet its unity was a facade. Underneath, distrust festered, brothers who plotted against brothers, alliances built to be broken. To the French court, Arthur was the rightful heir to the lands across the Channel. To many in England, he was a dangerous inconvenience, a reminder that John's right to rule was not unquestionable. As a boy, Arthur could not name the weight that followed him, but he could feel it. The way conversations ended when he walked into a chamber, the eyes that studied him too long, measuring what he might become. Would this boy grow into a king, or into a threat that must be removed? For now, he was still a child, allowed to ride, to train, to learn the language of diplomacy without tasting its venom. But even innocence has a shadow. His very existence forced the great lords to choose sides before he could even choose his own path. Far away, in the court of Philip II of France, his name was spoken with a sharper purpose. The French king saw him not as a boy, but as a weapon, one that could unseat John and fracture England's power. It was a dangerous kind of attention, the kind that offers a crown with one hand and holds a dagger in the other. Arthur was growing into his role, though he never asked for it. A symbol wrapped in flesh and blood, drawn into a game that had no safe way out. And symbols, in a world built on power, do not often live to see their own future. When Richard I died, the tension that had followed Arthur since birth would ignite, and the boy raised in the shadow of a broken crown would find himself standing at the edge of a war. The day Richard I died, the fragile balance holding the empire together shattered. Arthur was barely 15, still young enough to be called a boy, yet old enough to be seen as a rival. By law in France, his claim was strong. By ambition in England, John's grip was stronger. It was a clash written into the bloodline long before either man could choose their fate. The news came like a crack of thunder. In Normandy, courtiers began whispering in corners, weighing which banner would fly over their castles. Some swore loyalty to John, the man on the ground, with an army ready to move. Others looked to Arthur, the rightful heir by birth, and saw in him a chance to defy John's rise. Arthur himself would have felt the shift, like the air before a storm. Yesterday he had been a prince in waiting, guarded by the promise of the future. Today, every smile in court carried a question. Would you dare challenge your own uncle for the crown? John moved quickly, summoning allies, locking down strongholds, sealing the ports that might carry Arthur to safety. It was not just politics, it was survival. Because John knew what history so often proves: a claimant left alive is a threat that never sleeps. For Arthur, the choice was brutal and simple. Stand alone against an uncle who held the crown in his hands, or seek the one ally with the power to tip the scales: King Philip II of France. It was a decision that would define him, and it would place him squarely in the crosshairs of the man who had once been his blood. And when Arthur stepped into the French court, he believed he was stepping into salvation. He did not yet see that every promise made in those gilded halls carried a hidden blade. If you've seen our story on Louis VII and the Second Crusade, you'll know how kings use faith and friendship as weapons, and Arthur was about to learn that lesson the hard way. He crossed into France not as a fugitive, but as a prince seeking justice. The gates of Philip II's court opened to him with ceremony: polished floors, banners in the Capetian blue, the air thick with the scent of wine and calculation. Here, Arthur believed, was the ally who could right the wrongs of Richard's death and John's seizure of the crown. Philip welcomed him with a smile that could warm a room or hide a plan. He spoke of loyalty, of the right of kings, of the injustice done to a rightful heir. And for a boy raised in the shadow of suspicion, those words were intoxicating. But alliances forged in the glow of courtly hospitality often hide the shadows where knives are kept. Arthur's presence was more than symbolic. For Philip, he was a living claim, a way to pull Normandy and Anjou from English hands without lifting a blade himself. Every feast, every public audience was a performance meant to send a message across the Channel. The French crown stood with Arthur, and John, watching from England, could not ignore it. Yet behind the bright halls and courteous bows, the truth was colder. Philip's war was not for Arthur's future. It was for his own expansion. Arthur might sit beside the king at the banquet table, but in the war councils, he was still the youngest voice, the least powerful hand. The promises whispered to him were heavy with conditions, each one binding him closer to a throne he could not reach without Philip's will. Still, Arthur's confidence grew. He began to see himself not as a boy under protection, but as a commander in the making. French captains deferred to him in public, fueling the image of a prince ready to reclaim his birthright. It was exactly what he needed, and exactly what would lead him into the most dangerous moment of his life. Because when the chance came to strike at John directly, Arthur would take it and walk straight into a trap from which there would be no return. It was supposed to be his victory. In the summer of 1202, word reached Arthur that his grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was trapped in the castle at Mirebeau. If he could seize her, he could break John's grip on Aquitaine and force the crown to the bargaining table. The plan was bold and fatally flawed. Riding with French support, Arthur moved quickly, surrounding the town. Inside, Eleanor, the aging queen who had outlived 2 kings and shaped the fate of an empire, waited behind stone walls. But while Arthur believed he had the advantage, John was already moving, and John did not ride to negotiate. He rode to end the game. Before dawn, John's forces struck with brutal speed. The siege lines around Mirebeau were thin, unprepared for a counterattack. In the confusion, shouts in French and English clashed in the narrow streets. Steel rang against stone, and the air filled with the chaos of men who realized too late they were surrounded. Arthur's camp crumbled. Some knights fled, others cut down where they stood. The young prince was pulled from the fight, not as a commander, but as a prize. The kind of prize kings do not ransom, the kind they keep. Captured alongside him were many of his closest allies, including high-ranking nobles whose loyalty had once seemed unshakable. For John, this was more than a military win. It was a personal triumph. He had not just beaten his nephew, he had taken him alive. And a claimant in chains is a far more useful weapon than a corpse, at least for a time. What awaited Arthur in captivity would not be the mercy of family, but the slow erosion of a life that had once seemed destined for a crown. The walls closed in long before the doors locked. From the moment Arthur was dragged from the chaos at Mirebeau, he was no longer a prince on campaign. He was a prisoner of the crown he was meant to inherit. First came Falaise. Its towers loomed over the town like a warning, its cells built to erase the idea of escape. Here, Arthur's chains were not just iron, they were the silence of corridors where no voice answered his, the absence of sunlight in rooms that smelled of stone and damp straw. A cell can break a man's body. The quiet breaks his mind. Yet it was not only the confinement that pressed on him. He knew others had been taken, men who had pledged loyalty in better days. Some were locked in nearby chambers, their fates tied to his. But already, there were whispers that a few had been offered freedom, at a price that began with betraying his cause. From Falaise, Arthur was moved to Rouen, deeper into John's control, and farther from any hope of rescue. Here, the guards did not speak to him beyond the necessities. Even the food was left without a word, as if to remind him he was not worth a conversation. Time lost meaning. Days and nights blurred into a single stretch of cold and hunger. What thoughts filled his mind then? Did he dream of the moment he would walk free? Banners raised in his name? Or did he begin to wonder if the world outside those walls had already moved on without him? The boy who had once ridden with kings now lived in the shadow of a man who had no intention of letting him grow old. And the walls around him were not built to hold him forever. They were built to prepare him for the end. If you've watched our story on the princes in the tower, you'll know that captivity can be the slowest form of execution. And Arthur's next chapter would prove it. Because soon, the whispers outside his cell would grow louder, and his fate would be decided in the kind of silence only fear can create. It began with footsteps that didn't belong. In a fortress where the guards kept to their routines, even the smallest change could carry meaning. Arthur noticed it. Heavier boots at unusual hours. Voices cut off when he drew near. Soon, the rumors crept in like cold through the cracks. Some said John had visited Rouen in secret. Others claimed the king had dined well that night and left his table with a flush of wine and a mindset on ending his nephew's claim for good. In places like this, truth and fear often share the same face. From the Breton prisoners came darker whispers that Arthur would never leave Rouen alive. Some believed he would be moved again, sent to a deeper cell from which no one returned. Others muttered that John would do the deed himself, unwilling to trust any hand but his own. Arthur's world shrank to the sound of keys turning in the lock. Every time the door opened, he searched the faces of the men who entered, trying to read whether they came to feed him or finish him. Even the flicker of a torch in the hallway could send his thoughts racing. John's court, far from Rouen, was already shaping the story. In England, there would be no official announcement, no public trial. If Arthur disappeared, it would be explained away, An illness in prison, perhaps, or a failed escape attempt no one could prove. But within the walls of Rouen, the silence had a different weight. It was the kind of quiet that falls before something irreversible. And when the moment finally came, it would arrive without warning. A night where every sound in the corridor could be the last he would ever hear. The night did not begin with screams. It began with silence, the kind that presses against the walls and makes every flicker of a torch seem louder than it should. Arthur sat in the dark, listening. Somewhere beyond the stone, footsteps slowed, then stopped. Keys scraped against iron. The door did not open right away. When it did, the light from the corridor cut across the floor in a sharp, narrow blade. Two men stepped inside, their faces unreadable, their voices low, too low to carry into the hall. One carried a jug, the other something wrapped in cloth. What happened next would never be recorded in any official chronicle. Some would later claim Arthur was taken quietly, led away under the pretense of a transfer. Others swore he fought back, his shouts swallowed by the thick walls of Rouen. The truth was locked in that room, with only the stone to bear witness. By morning, the cell was empty. No body, no sign of a struggle, nothing for his supporters to rally around. In England, John's court said nothing. In France, Philip's court said everything, accusing John of murder before the ink was dry on the rumors. Arthur's name became more dangerous in death than it had been in life. And for the boy who vanished in chains, the silence after that night would roar louder than any battle. If you've watched our story on the Black Dinner, you'll know how the removal of a single life can shatter the balance of kingdoms. And Arthur's death was about to do the same. Because in the months ahead, the ripples from Rouen would spread across Brittany and Normandy, turning loyalty into open revolt. The silence from Rouen did not stay contained. It spilled into the streets of Brittany and Normandy like a rumor carried on the wind, impossible to trace, impossible to stop. In Brittany, Arthur had been more than a prince. He was a son of their own blood, a link between their duchy and the highest crown in Christendom. When word came that he was gone, grief hardened into fury. Nobles who had once tread carefully between loyalty and rebellion now chose openly. Their allegiance shifted to the French king, not out of love, but out of hatred for the man they believed had murdered their duke. Normandy followed, though its anger burned differently. Here, John's rule had already been strained by heavy taxes and mistrust. Arthur's disappearance was the final insult, proof, to many, that John valued power over honor and fear over loyalty. Philip II wasted no time. He summoned Arthur's allies, promising justice. In truth, justice was a banner under which he could march. War was no longer a possibility. It was the inevitable consequence of one boy's absence. Castles that had once flown the Angevin standard now opened their gates to the French. Border garrisons changed hands overnight. Each loss of a fortress was not just a military defeat for John. It was a public reminder that his own subjects no longer trusted him to keep their lands or their lives safe. By the year's end, much of Normandy was on the verge of collapse. John had won the boy, but in killing him, or letting him vanish, he had lost the lands that boy had bound to his crown. And with each territory that slipped away, John's power at home began to rot from the inside, a decay that no army could stop. A king's greatest enemy is not the war he loses, but the story that survives him. For John, Arthur's disappearance became that story, a shadow that clung to his name in every hall, every court, every whispered conversation. In Brittany, his name was spoken with spit and clenched fists. In France, it was paired with the word murderer. Even in England, among those who had once sworn loyalty, there were murmurs that the crown had been stained in a way no coronation could cleanse. John tried to govern, to rebuild what the revolts had torn apart. But power built on fear cannot heal a wound carved by betrayal. Every treaty he signed was seen as a confession in disguise. Every tax he raised was blamed on the loss of Normandy, which in turn was blamed on the boy who had vanished in his care. The chroniclers of the time, men who lived by the favor of kings, rarely wrote his guilt plainly. But between their lines, the truth bled through, that a ruler who kills his own blood forfeits more than a throne. He forfeits the right to be remembered as anything but a warning. Years later, when John's reign stumbled into fresh disasters, the ghost of Arthur still followed him. In battles lost, in lands surrendered, in rebellions that would not die down, his nephew's absence was always there, an unburied accusation. And long after John's body was laid in the ground, the verdict remained. He had not just lost his nephew, he had lost his soul. But Arthur's story did not end in the cell at Rouen. It lived on, carried by the people who refused to let his name fade, and by the kingdoms forever changed by the night he disappeared. Arthur of Brittany entered history as a boy with a crown in reach, and left it as a name spoken only in whispers. Before his capture, he was a symbol of hope to some and a threat to others, a figure around whom kingdoms aligned and armies marched. After his disappearance, he became something rarer, a shadow that reshaped borders, toppled loyalties, and haunted a king's legacy. John may have held the power in that final moment, but in the years that followed, it was Arthur's absence that ruled the story. The crown gained by silencing him cost more than the throne could repay. Lost lands, lost allies, and a name forever cursed in the chronicles of medieval history. And maybe that's the lesson his fate leaves behind. That power taken through fear is never truly secure, and that some ghosts do not fade, no matter how many years pass. If you found this story worth remembering, let us know. Subscribe to the channel, like, share, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Explore more dark tales of betrayal and downfall in our playlist Royal Blood and Tortures, the dark medieval tales, where history's most haunting moments still wait to be told. And I'll see you in the next video.